Hello and welcome to Prophecy 101. I'm your host, Kendall Shoulders. Today we'll be talking about Negroland again, Negroland Revisited -1 Part 7. The reason I call it -1 is because it's the first part of revisiting Negroland. We got a lot of information that we want to add to this. We want to just keep building on it so that when you go back and you begin to talk about this subject matter with other people, you'll be well versed in what you need to talk about. All right, so -1 means it's the first part of the revisitation, but then part 7 we're adding it on to the 6 parts that we've already done. And before I get started on this one, real good, I want to give a shout out to a brother named Benayah Israel. A lot of the information that I'm using today will come from a lot of the research that he's done. I mean, he's done an amazing job from a historical perspective, finding all these old references back from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s that verify who we are as a people. It verifies what the Jews look like. I mean, it's just some amazing stuff. So I grabbed a few of those references from him. Decided to do a supplement to the Negroland videos, and that way a lot of people are going out and starting to present this information, and this would just simply solidify what you already know, but it'll give you more historical evidence so that you can go back and you can have a great foundation when you get ready to talk to people about this subject matter. Now, as we go, I got references that date all the way back to 1600, so I'll start with the earliest stuff first, and then we'll just progress through those slides. And these are actually old books, and a lot of these books are now being archived. A lot of these books you could only find in Harvard and Yale and all these prestigious institutions. They had all these books. But now they're starting to take these old books and they're starting to electronically archive them. Google is archiving a lot of these things. There's a lot of places that's archiving all of these old books. And so you can find these things online. And in these slides, I'm going to have the slides available for you. I put links here inside of the slide, so you can just copy and paste that into your browser, and you can go directly to some of these books. But anyway, just be aware of that, and so you can use all these references. They're putting them online, and I mean, it's a great resource. So this first book is called Travels in Holland, the United Provinces, England. So we're talking about England, Scotland, and Ireland. And this was around 1634 to 1635. And so I'm not going to read everything, but in this particular text, they were describing the Jews, and they were talking about the Sabbath and all these type things. And then when you get to page 61, and I'll start here in page 61, it said that the sons of Aaron and Levites have longer white robes than the rest. And here in this congregation, no good order, no great zeal and devotion here appearing, much time spent in singing and in talking. We went hence to an Englishman and his wife, lately turned Jew, as it said, merely to enrich themselves. So what they were saying here, that the Englishmen were converts. They turned Jews so that they could do some business with the Jews here. It said very obstinate and ignorant both. And he said he is a merchant of tobacco. This said his wife, being an handsome woman, was a courtesan in London. They were talking about the Jews when they said this. They said they deny all the New Testament, their men most black, full of hair, and insatiably given unto women, their wives restrained and made prisoners, their widows distinguished from all other women Jews by white veils hanging to their backs. They would not bury among the Gentiles, but have purchased unto themselves a peculiar place, a field on the waterside, some 3 or 4 English miles from the town, wherein are erected their sepulchres, and when they remove also their bones thence away with them. So these people are described in 1600 England and Scotland and Ireland, and said they're most black and they're full of hair and they're insatiably given unto women. And it says when they move, when they get ready to move, they take the bones out of the grave and they move them with them. Well, when we study the Old Testament, of course, we know that our people, specifically when we first heard of this, was when Joseph told his brothers and his descendants. He said, "Don't, when you leave out of here, don't leave my bones. Take my bones with you." This next source is in a book called America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World by John Ogilvy. He lived from 1600 to 1676, and this was published for the first time in 1671. And so he was describing the Jews I think in Portuguese. It said the Portuguese that dwell on this island and formed the Netherlanders. The few lived above 50 years. Yet notwithstanding the great gain tempted them to tarry, several of them having 200 or 300 Negroes that worked in the sugar. Now, what they're talking about in this particular text is that the Portuguese, and we'll talk about it in a later lesson, but the Portuguese began to ship what they call the Negroes. They were kicking them out of Portugal after the Jews had gotten kicked out of Spain. They went to Portugal, and then they got kicked out of Portugal, and they started shipping them to an island called St. Thomas. And the St. Thomas was off the coast of West Africa. And so this is what this text is talking about. So it said that John the Third, King of Portugal, sent a colony there above 200 years before, whom thought the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. Talking about St. Thomas. For he sent new inhabitants, who first settled in Guinea, next in Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be the better used to the air, that the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom coming thither in great numbers most of the present inhabitants were descended. So first he calls them Negroes, and then down here he said that the king sold all those Jews for slaves. So the Negroes were the slaves. This next book called Africa, being an accurate description of the region of Egypt, Barbary, Libya, and I don't know how to pronounce that. Bildugarit, the land of Negroes, Guinea, Ethiopia, and the Abyssinians. Okay, so it says here that many Jews are scattered over this region. Talking about Africa, it says some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of the river Niger. Now you have to understand that the river Niger at that time was the river Niger. So that's the correct pronunciation of it. It changed over the years because the word nigger became offensive, but it was the river Niger. So others are Asian strangers who fled thither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian, or from Judea wasted and depopulated by the Romans. So he's saying that the region of Africa, or Egypt, or Negro, or Guinea, Ethiopia, all of this was, this is where the Jews came and began to settle. And it said on both sides of the river Niger. And so that's a great reference right there. Now, what's also great about this reference is it begins to talk about how the Jews, when they were banished out of Europe, when they were banished out of other parts of Italy, when they got kicked out of Spain, when they got kicked out of France, when they got kicked out of England, and it's saying that they came to this part of Africa. So there's a great reference here. And just to give you an idea, if you wanted to buy one of these old books that you can find at Harvard or find at one of these places, this particular book, Africa, being an accurate description of the regions of Egypt, cost about $1,400. So as you can see, by them now doing this electronically and putting it online, It's going to save you a significant amount of money. So take advantage of the references that are online, and look these things up. This next reference is titled "A New Voyage to Italy" by Maximilian Mission, and so it reads. He was talking about the Jews in Portugal, and but it's ridiculous to imagine that the Jews, as being Jews, have a peculiar smell. So he was talking about they smell bad. He said the Jews at Rome, now he's referencing the Jews at Rome, are very poor. And those who are poor are always nasty. So he's saying that the Jews at Rome are always poor and always nasty. He's saying those who are nasty usually stink. He said that is the mystery. 'Tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black. For this is only true of the Portuguese Jews, who marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves, and consequently the swarthiness means blackness, of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race, even in the northern region. So this is a great reference here, and you can read as much of this material as you want. I'm just going over just a little bit. And then there's another book here called The Memoirs of the Secret Services of John Mackey, Esquire, during the reigns of King William, Queen Anne, and King George I of London. So this particular book is a great book, and it's talking about the different people that worked under the services of these kings and queens. And so he goes through the book and he's describing all of these different people and how they look. And so in this particular one, he's describing, looks like Daniel Earl of Nottingham, the Secretary of State. So he was describing the Secretary of State, and he gets over here and he says, and he has also the exterior air and application enough to make him very capable. It said in his habit and manners very formal. He was a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or Jew, about 50 years old. And so it was a common thing, if you were a Jew, that blackness went along with being a Jew. Alright, and this next book called The Critical Review or Annals of Literature by a Society of Gentlemen, written around 1784. It says here that Prince Henry colonies were enlarged by his successors. King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. So he was expelling all the Jews to Africa. And from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called. So they would call them Jews, and then they would say the black Portuguese, as they are called. And the Jews in Loango, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. And so he goes on in there and said the Negroes were purchased by Guinea, Congo, and Monte-Congo, and the colonists had plantations furnished with from 150 to 3,000 Negro slaves. So as you can see, the slave trade really started in Spain. Alright, this next book is a narrative of travels and discoveries in northern and central Africa in the years 1822 and 1823 by Denham Dixon. So he's talking to a sheik in Africa, and he's the guy. The sheik is talking to the guy who's doing the traveling, who happens to be a Christian. And he asked him, is he a Christian? He said, even so, replied I, have read of you. You are better than Jews. So he's saying, I've heard about the Christians, and I've heard that you are better than Jews, said he. And he asked the question, the sheik asked him the question, are Jews white like you? And so the Christian answered him, said, no, replied I, rather more like yourself, very dark. Really, said the sheik, why are they not quite white? They are a bad people. So as you study these references as well, you'll realize nobody really liked us. So that hadn't changed much. So, but that's just part of it. So when you read these references, you'll see a whole lot of this. All right, and another book written in around 1848 called A Tribute to the Negro by Wilson Armistead. All right, so he writes in his book, and I put several pages here together. It says that a remarkable fact in the history of Loango in the Empire of Congo, so he's talking about the Congo, is that the country, according to a statement which was fully credited by Oldthorpe, himself a writer of most correct judgment and of impeachable veracity, contains many Jews settled in it. Talking about many Jews settled in the Empire of the Congo, who retained their religious rights. In other words, they kept their religious traditions and rights, and the distinct habits which keeps them isolated from other nations. Though thus separate from the African population, he said, because of the way they live, they're separate from the African population. He said, they are black and resemble the other Negroes in every respect as to physical character. It is probably in allusion to this case that Pennican in his textbook says the descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea settled on the coast of Africa are black. Okay. Then he goes on to say later on, he said they have a peculiar cast of countenance which distinguishes them from other blacks. Their cheekbones are higher and more prominent. And then he goes on to describe their hair, and he said their teeth are generally good, their hair is woolly, though not completely frizzled. And then it says the Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than many Africans. This next reference, titled Physical Geography by A. Barrington, this was written in 1851. It said, thus the Jews are a people who have ever, according to the prophecy, dwelt alone without intermixing with the nations to this day. Now this separate race all descended from brown ancestors. For Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must have been as dark as more Yohanan, if not darker. Exhibit every shade of color from the black Jew of Malabar, of whom we have such an interesting account by Dr. Claudius Buchanan, to the rose and lily complexion of the Jewishness on the banks of the Elbe. Okay. You go on down there, it says that the Spanish Jew is always dark complexion, and his hair is uniformly black, whilst the German Jew is often as fair as any German and has lighter red hair with blue eyes. Now, you got to understand that he's referring to the Ashkenazi Jews at that point. So he said the various shades of color observable among the Negro or African race tends to the same conclusion. Along the coast of Guinea, which is low, marshy, and hot, we find jet black complexion. And this is the very country from which American Negroes have been derived. So now he's telling us that, we're coming from the West Coast, and of course, we're Jews. Alright, now on the classification and geographical distribution of the mammalia, being a lecture on Sir Robert Reed Foundation, delivered before the University of Cambridge in May of 1859. So these prestigious universities had this information for a while. This guy was giving a lecture, and this is what he said. He said, for 1800 years, that race, talking about the Jewish race, has been dispersed in different latitudes and climates, and they have preserved themselves distinct from intermixture with other races of mankind. There are some Jews still lingering in the valleys of the Jordan, having been oppressed by the successive conquerors of Syria for ages, a low race of people, and described by trustworthy travelers as being as black as any other Ethiopian races. Others of the Jewish people participating in European civilization and dwelling in the northern nation show instances of the light complexion, the blue eyes, and light hair of the Scandinavian families. Now they're talking about the Ashkenazi. So he said and the scriptures verify this, and I'll find that scripture. But it says that even when we were when the Assyrians came in, when the Babylonians came in, when the Romans came in, there was a remnant left. And most of these, if you'll Google black Palestinian, you'll see that there are black Palestinians still lingering in the land of Israel at this point that never left, and they still have their complexion. They're still black, and they, when the war, when Israel, the nation of Israel, today's nation of Israel, start to bomb the Palestinians, normally it's the black Palestinians that's in between those two that are fighting, and they normally get the worst of the deal. But you don't hear about that on the news. But Google black Palestinians, you'll see that the black Palestinians are really the descendants of the real Hebrews. This next reference, the natural history of man, comprising inquiries into. This is volume 1 by James Cowles Pritchard, 1855. And he was saying that the beards of the Jews are very conspicuous. The Jews of Portugal are very dark. And so we keep seeing this theme over and over, especially about the Portuguese and Spanish Jews. Okay, so, and we have to understand when we talk about the Portuguese Jews that we're talking also about the Jews of Spain, because they were kicked out of Spain, then they ended up migrating to Portugal, and then they ended up getting kicked out of Portugal. So when we ended up in West Africa, we ended up on slave ships, and we ended up coming to the Americas and Brazil, the islands, Jamaica, Haiti, along the Mexican borders, Brazil, and it ended up in the Americas later on, in America or United States later on. So in this natural history of man, it said the Jews of Portugal are very dark. Jews, as is well known, have been spread from early times through many countries in the eastern parts of Asia, in China, Tartary, and the northern parts of India. So we're everywhere. Just like the scripture said, we were spread out to the four corners of the earth. It said their residence in Koken appears to have been from ancient times. And you're talking about Asia. And they are now black, and so completely like the native inhabitants in their complexion that Dr. Claudius Buchanan says he could not always distinguish them from the Hindus, because the Hindus are dark. He has surmised that the blackness of the Jews spread through different parts of India is attributable to intermarriages with Hindus, but of this there is no evidence. So he was trying to figure out why they were so dark. So he just said, well, maybe they intermarried with the Hindus, but that's not the case for the most part. He said it is probable that the preservation of the Jews in these countries are a distinct people is owing, as elsewhere, just like everywhere else, to their avoiding all intermixture with the native inhabitants. So what he's saying is, he's saying one author was trying to say, well, maybe they're so dark because they intermarried with the Hindus, who are very dark. But he said more than likely it's because they avoided all intermixture with the native inhabitants. So, all right, so we have another reference here, The Races of Men by Robert Knox in 1862. All right, so in his book, he was talking about he surveyed the Jewish population on the streets of London. And so he said, I fancied I could perceive three different casts of features. The first, Jewish. Okay, so then he talks about that. But then he goes over here and he's talking about the features of the Jewish race. And so he starts saying, he said, the nose comparatively at the base, the eyes consequently approaching each other, lips very full, mouth projecting, chin small, and the whole physiognomy, when swarthy, talking about when they're black, swarthy means black, as it often is, talking about most of the time it is, has an African look. So we're not talking about Middle Eastern. When people start talking about the Jews being dark-skinned people, they they look Middle Eastern. No, they have an African look. All right, so we need to understand that, and when find that it's in the young person with no exaggeration of any of the features. All right, so you can read that, and like I said, these links are here, so just grab those, copy and paste. All right, this next reference sources of history in the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch is the first five books of the Old Testament. And this lecture was given in Princeton at a theological seminary in March 1882. And so he was saying, and that's what I'm saying. These prestigious institutions had this information for the longest, but if only certain people could go there, only a few people are gonna know. That's why these secret societies know what's going on. It's in regard to the human race, it has been shown abundantly and historically that each of the external differences often ceases to be characteristic. Thus, the black color is found not only in individuals as the black Jews of Portugal, but in tribes, as the Bakaris on the Red Sea, whose hair and character are perfectly Semitic, and the white color in the brutalized descendants of a certain exile Irish of Ulster, whose features are almost of African type. And so they're trying to tie those in with the African as well. Alright, so those are just a few references that I wanted to go over. But the question becomes, why call it again Negroland? I know I kind of covered that in the first video, part 1, and but I don't feel like it was given enough justice, so I'm just going to give a little bit extra here before we close out. So why Negroland? Alright, so let's look at this next text here. It said the history of the Jews from the destruction of Jerusalem to the present time. So when the Jews, everywhere the Jews went, they were hated. We were hated. We're hated today. We're just a hated people. Okay, that is part of it. He said we would be hated for his namesake, just simply for the fact that even though they don't call us by his name, just for his namesake, because of who we are, we're hated. Okay, so in this book, The History of the Jews from the Destruction of Jerusalem to the Present Time, it was written in 1840. I'm just going to read it. It said, in Portugal, the name of a Jew is a term of such high reproach. In other words, people are offended just using the term Jew. They hate them. That the government found it necessary to enact a law which forbade any person to call another by that appellation. In other words, they made a law because they hated the Jews so much that they said you can't even call him a Jew. Don't even call him a Jew. And then they say if a man who is styled a Jew to his face stabs the offender, the law does not condemn him. In other words, if you see somebody calling one of those black Portuguese a Jew, and we know they're Jew, but if we see you calling them a Jew, and somebody walks up and stabs you for calling them a Jew, no problem. We're not even going to condemn the person that did it because you shouldn't have never been calling them a Jew to begin with. So that's what he's saying. And trifling as this regulation may appear, it has produced beneficial effect. In other words, the beneficial effect is that you could no longer call a Jew. And so that's why the term black Portuguese came up. Alright, so, but let's look at this. The term Negro. Where did it come from? It says here that it originated in the mid-16th century. It was Spanish and Portuguese from the Latin nigger, which means black. Alright, so they wouldn't have called us black in the English. They would have called us black in their language, and black in their language was Negro. Alright, so when you look at this next reference, it said the same thing. It comes from the word Negro, and so what does that mean then? All right, let's check this out. All right, so let's go back to one of the original references that we looked at, Africa being an accurate description of the regions of Egypt. All right, so when we were banished everywhere, they call us Negroes. Why? Because that's what the Spanish and the Portuguese called us. So it ended up, it said many Jews are scattered over these regions. And then we were scattered on both sides of the river nigger. So, you know, when we were scattered on both sides of the river, niggers, and not only were we referenced to as niggers at this point, but we were also Negroes. And so this began to be what they call Negroland. Okay, so the idolaters are numerous in Negroland, upper and lower Ethiopian towards the great ocean. So the whole area where we migrated to, and the whole area where we were deported to from Spain and Portugal, you know, they didn't call us Jews anymore because it was against the law in Portugal and Spain. So everybody knew that when you said the Negro, that was talking about the Portuguese Jew. And so hence the term Negroland came on the scene. All right, so even on the map, you got Sudan, and then you got, I'm not sure what language that is, older Negridian, and it means Negro land. Okay, so that's some interesting information. So here's that other word here called Sudan. Let's see what that means. So in the Hebrew, Sudan comes from two words. So means foreigner, and Udan, because there's no J in the Hebrew language, Udan, and it means Judah. So it's foreigners of Judah. So what it's saying here in Negroland, the foreigners of Judah, of Negroland. So they knew that this whole area right here, that's why they call it Negroland, was because it was full of Negroes who had to be called Negroes because it was against the law coming out of Portugal to call us Jews. Now, that's interesting. All right, so there was another book called Bulletin de la Société de Geographic. Now, if you think I did that correctly, more power to you, but I just kind of felt that out. But anyway, my brother translated this from French, and the translation, Google Translation, this is what it says here. So you got Wida, Fida, Hoida, Oida, Judah, or Judah. All of these are the same. It's just different versions of Judah, or it's a city of old, frequented since the 16th century, since 1500s, by the Portuguese slavers who gave it its name. So they named it Judah. It said its inhabitants were said to be this Judaica, and they were indeed considered as a remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel in the north. The Alela River, whose true name is Ephra, became the Euphrates for scholars. In other words, because the children of Judah settled there, the Portuguese are the one that named it Judah. And then our people, when they tend to settle at these different places, tend to name the cities the same as they were in Israel, and so then they named this river the Euphrates. So when you blow up the west coast of Africa and you look down on the ancient map, then you'll see the kingdom of Judah, or Wida, on the slave coast. And so a lot of the kingdom of Judah settled here. They were shipped here. Some of them settled here, but the Portuguese called it the kingdom of Judah. They named it after the people that they knew were the descendants of the tribes of Israel. Okay, particularly Judah. Okay, so that goes back. It goes back to one of the slides that we did in the original Negroland, and we looked at the Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary, and it says Ham, the youngest son of Noah, born probably about 96 years before the flood, and one of 8 persons to go through the flood. He became the progenitor of the dark races, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. So they understood it. Zondervan Bible Dictionary understood that the term Negro really meant uh, the Jewish, the black Jews in Portugal and Spain. So they knew this, and they knew that the Negroes did not come from Ham, because the Negroes were Semitic, and we came from Shem. And so there was only three after the flood. There was Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And so they've been knowing this for a while. So this is just some information. When you combine this with the information that you already have with the Negroland 1, or the Negroland 1 video, and you combine that with this information, and you begin to do your presentation to whoever you're talking to, this right here simply adds even more strength to an already strong presentation. So make sure you share this information. I'll get the slide up in the description section as soon as I can. We'll build on this information, and we'll try to as y'all allow, we'll try to go back through, and we'll look at the curses that we've endured again to supplement the other video, and then we'll also look at the Antichrist spirit and all that comes along with it, and the suffering and all, and how it fulfilled the prophecies that's written in Scripture. So y'all willing, I'll be able to go over those type things again and add to what's already in the first 6 videos of Negroland, and hopefully even get even more clarification about what Yah has planned for the end times as relates to us and his people. So I hope